Current Chaos Space Marines have a large amount of spikes, trims, and all these other details that make them very complicated. However, I had an idea when I looked over the sprue and realized that the two miniatures were nearly identical. What happened to the Chaos Space Marines before they got all their crazy looking armor and started looking the way they are? So I started off by grabbing this Chosen set and picking out a few pieces, mainly this really awesome looking sword, and a cool loincloth to match the Chaos aesthetic. I limited myself quite a bit to what pieces I could actually take due to the fact that I didn't want to destroy the whole set, so I only picked out some of the pieces that I knew were going to be extra. As the loincloth was not actually meant for this piece, I had to scrape off a proper amount and make sure that it will attach properly. To ensure that, I'll be using some sprue goo, which is my all-time favorite thing to use in every single kit badge to make sure that when I attach my pieces, they'll be there permanently. When it came to the shoulder pads, I did consider using some of the more chaosy ones, however, I thought just using the classic Horus Heresy ones would create a much more interesting aesthetic. I really want to make sure that these guys look like they were some of the first heretics only beginning to get corrupted by chaos, so I want to avoid some of the very excessive trims that you find on current chaos models. While the idea to remove the trims from the arm holding the sword did cross my mind, I decided to keep them there. I really enjoy the idea that the sword is actually a conduit for the powers of chaos, slowly whispering into his mind and giving him some extra ideas regarding the whole heresy. When it came to choosing the head, I did also consider using some of these mutated heads, however, matching the original idea, I decided to go with the Horus Heresy one, which I thought looked a lot more appropriate for this model. While my original intention was to actually include the Power Claw on the Power Fist, I decided to go against that since I have a much more interesting idea that I want to implement when painting the model. In order to make this heretic feel a little bit extra special, I decided to give him this really cool thematic base and make it a bit more interesting. This is the base from a Primaris kit, however, I think it matches the idea behind this model perfectly and creates a very nice podium to display what the model is representing on the battlefield. I also included some extra things on the base as if this guy is getting ready to stop a massive explosion. And with that, the first heretic was done. However, when I was done with my first miniature, I realized that I should make another one because 2 is always better than 1. A while ago, I finished the skill team box that left me with a lot of really cool bits. However, just like previously, the hardest thing about this is going to be holding myself back and not using the most chaosy looking parts. I was also quite surprised to find out just how many different pieces I had in that box and how many different options I could actually try out, including this very random Votann Power Fist that surprisingly looked very size appropriate and I was really tempted to use it. However, I think it would match a future kit bash much better, so for now, I moved back into the Chaos pieces. As I was quite indecisive on what right arm I actually want to use, I just settled on my left arm, which I knew was going to be this really cool bolter pistol. For the head, I once again settled for one from the Horus Heresy kit. And after attaching the bolter, I realized that the most appropriate arm for this guy would actually be the Power Fist, Power Claw combination. I did have a second loincloth that I really wanted to use this miniature. Unfortunately, when I started to modify it, it became quite clear to me that it wasn't going to attach on this model. The only way to make this work would be to remove a portion of his leg, which is not an ideal scenario. So for now, I decided to remove this extra spike from the pistol that I thought was making it look a little bit extra chaosy. To compensate for the lack of loincloth, I decided to add some extra details to the miniature by scraping on some of these damaged marks and drilling in some extra holes where some bolter shells possibly landed but didn't penetrate the armor. For the paint job, I'll be going for something very simple, but hopefully something that'll still look interesting. However, I think that you can actually simplify this color scheme and make it much more tabletop appropriate and paint an entire army like that very fast, but you can still apply additional details to your HQs to make them pop off the table and have those additional cool details. For the armor, I knew that I wanted my red to start off with these very warm colors and then work my way a little bit slightly into the colder tones of this very crimson color and then work my way back into a very slightly orange saturated hue. However, beside that, I decided to go with a Horus Heresy color set I felt like would be much more appropriate for these guys. After applying my base tones, I decided to do some of the black details as I knew that if I made any mistakes, it would be very easy to fix right now. Once I'm finished with that, I started to highlight my colors using in this primary red from Liquitex. However, unfortunately, when I began applying the color, it looked really good, so I thought it was pretty solid. However, when it dried, it gave me this very weird patchy texture, so I decided to go with this deep red instead. So I made sure to cover all of my details, and luckily on the second model, I didn't have time to do any of that color, so I was just able to apply this primary red on its own. For my highlights, I'm actually avoiding doing any edge highlights and instead going for more volumetric highlights. focusing on more of the surface and creating an idea of a diffused light. However, I do also go into some of the edge highlight areas, but only a few of them, and it's mostly in the areas where it meets the black. Next up, I added a bit of cadmium red to my primary red in about a 50-50 ratio. This creates a very bright red highlight, and it still doesn't exactly say orange, especially when you're looking at the model from far away. The benefit of working with red is also the fact that it tends to be very thin, so you're able to create much smoother layers and mix the colors between themselves much more interestingly. However, as with every upside, there's always a downside, and with this, it's the fact that you gotta do some additional layers just to make sure that the previous colors get fully covered. When I moved on to highlighting the black, I simply took a little bit of white paint and added it to my AK black. I've also recently noticed the fact that different brands have actually slightly different hues of blues to their black. For the shoulders, I did do classical edge highlights as I felt like it would work really well for this black tone. On a few of the previous kit bashes, I got a request to start including some decals as they make models much more interesting. However, this is a perfect example of the reason I avoid using decals like the plague. They look awesome, however, half the time they're extremely frustrating to put on, and sometimes they just outright fail. And while it's definitely a skill issue on my end, I do think they look awesome when you do actually manage to put them on. I also found out that I should probably avoid using varnish, as the thing I use called Microsol that helps these transfer sheets does melt it. This was the main reason I avoided applying the claw, as I felt like this would be a much more appropriate visual for this model, especially given the fact that word bearers are known to have a lot of text on their armor, including some tattoos on their face too. Previously, I also had the idea of including some manual text in his armor. However, I realized that using some of my essentially scratches to simulate the text on the glove would create a very odd looking contrast, so I decided to avoid that. For the face, I simply used some Bugman glow and added a little bit of white for the highlights, then using a bit of black to create this idea that they're actually having a little bit of hair stubble. I realized that all my previous models are somehow have been bald, and I've been using this technique to make them a little bit more interesting than just entirely smooth. Afterwards, I used some gunmetal gray to apply all the metallic colors, and I also decided to color in the trim that I thought looked really cool. Even though I did spend time applying some of the highlights to this backpack, once the better idea comes along, I think it's worth doing it. For the blade, I knew I wanted to create some extra contrast, so I decided to use some Tesseract glow over this white color. Unfortunately, what I didn't realize, even though the white paint is touted as being some of the best one, it had this very chalky and patchy effect that when I started applying the contrast paint did turn out a little bit weird. And then for the skulls, I decided to use some Agros Dunes just to create some really quick, awesome looking skulls. And with that, the miniatures are done. I simply added a few extra details to the base, painted them a little bit up, so it's time to see the final result. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Consider liking, disliking, and maybe even watching another video.